This is the second of two lectures on Heidegger. Intended to be introductory lectures to Heidegger's thought, although presupposing, the knowledge that we developed in our reading of metaphysics in Plato and also in Descartes in two previous lectures. So the first lecture was Heidegger, Dasein, and the Question, in which we explored differences between the Heideggerian concept of self and the subject and the Hegelian, Marxian, Kantian tradition of the rational subject, which is in relation to the objective world, and epistemologically how that rational subject constructs the objective world as opposed to the Heideggerian view of Dasein, the being that is in the world. This lecture will deal with the different conceptions of truth that emerge from a careful, close reading of Heidegger's text, particularly Being and Time, Introduction to Metaphysics, and Parmenides. This lecture will be followed by a third lecture. The third lecture is entitled Heidegger, Spirit, and Fascism, and in this case, we'll look at some of the political developments that occurred and the implications of Heidegger's affiliation with the Third Reich. Again, I've entitled this lecture "Heidegger and Truth." We see there Heidegger gazing upward. All right, although we know for Heidegger the truth wasn't up there in heaven, but was a more existential thinking of truth. Okay, so different ways of thinking about truth. So here are just some concepts that we're gonna discuss and review. These are just things that you should know about and think about. We've talked about the Cartesian idea of truth as competence, which another way of saying competence is correct perception. The perceiving subject perceiving the object in a way that is correct. Which Nietzsche is going to associate with the will to power. Ratio, adequation, veritas, these are all different ways of thinking about truth as correct perception or competence, which is, this is the Cartesian way of thinking about truth, and this is what is going to be a primary target of deconstruction of Heidegger and Derrida. Because they're going to argue that it's predicated on an unarticulated, assumed metaphysical ground. Aletheia, we'll discuss this. We've briefly talked about it previously. This we'll go into this more in this lecture. That truth is unconcealment, disclosure, revelation, event, and which implies temporality. And promise keeping, upholding vows, maintaining oaths. Now, this is more like akin to the Nietzschean view of the doctrine of the eternal return, which is going to be associated in Derrida's thought with the Abrahamic link to the idea of the upholding of oaths. We're not going to address that in this particular lecture, but we will get into more of that when we discuss Derrida and when we look at, for instance, his The Ear of the Other and his meditation on the Nietzschean doctrine of the eternal return. So I just mentioned that in passing because we'll talk about a little bit about it, but we're not going to get too far into it in this lecture. And then the Platonic Christian logos as articulated in the Gospel of John. How the Logos in the Christian era comes to be associated with Jesus, historical personage of Jesus of Nazareth, and then this more pre-Socratic thinking of Logos we're going to see in the thinking of Heraclitus, which Heidegger will discuss in Introduction to Metaphysics, which is more linked to this idea of what he's going to call gathering or the gathering togetherness. So we'll contrast what the thinking of Heraclitus, who was this thinker prior to Socrates on the question of logos, with the thinking of the logos that emerges in the Christian era. Okay, so let's begin. Let's start with Aletheia, the goddess truth. So Heidegger does, he includes a fragment from Parmenides, one of these pre-Socratic thinkers, although pre-Socratic was not a term that Heidegger liked, but he was a thinker prior to Socrates. Prior to Plato. I mean, some of these so-called pre-Socratics were contemporary with Socrates, but they thought differently than Plato anyway about questions of being. And so this is a little fragment that has been preserved from the thought of Parmenides, which Heidegger is going to look at very carefully and interpret. And he's going to examine how the goddess Aletheia, who is the goddess Truth, is described by Parmenides in this little fragment where Parmenides is sort of wandering through a path in the woods, and he comes to a clearing or an opening, and there he apprehends the goddess Aletheia. He says, and the goddess received me with sympathy. He says, she took my right hand in her hand. Then she spoke the word and addressed me in this way. O man, companion of mortal charioteers, arriving at our home with the steeds that convey you, blessing be bestowed on you. For it is not an evil fate which has sent you ahead to travel on this way. And truly, this way is apart from men, outside their trodden paths. This is interesting. We think again of this Heideggerian idea of philosophy as being this threefold path. So he's on this path as outside the well-trodden path, which is the path to the realm of becoming, but rather rule and order. There is, however, a need that you experience everything, both the stable heart of well-enclosing concealment, as well as the appearing in its appearance to mortals, where there is not relying on the unconcealed. Also this, however, you will learn to experience, how the appearing in the need remains called upon to be apparent while it shines through everything, and hence in that way brings everything to perfection. Now, Heidegger, as has been often noted, has fairly idiosyncratic interpretations of Greek texts. They're his own interpretations. And I just again want to underscore how translation and interpretation are inextricably connected. And so a translation is, in effect, an interpretation. It doesn't mean that his idiosyncratic translations are wrong. It's just he's coming about these translations in a very different way from a more, let's say, originary thinking about questions of being from his study of philosophy. Okay, so here's Heidegger. Anaximander, and remember, Anaximander was the one that we looked at previously in our discussion of justice, who this is where the idea of decay, Heideggerian view of justice, which he's getting from Anaximander, which enters into the thought of Derrida, Levinas, and so many other contemporary thinkers. So it's a very important essay from Heidegger's book, Early Greek Thinking, his fragment on Anaximander. But he's going to say here, Anaximander, Parmenides, and Heraclitus, and we're going to get readings of both Parmenides and Heraclitus, we'll look at in this lecture, are the only primordial thinkers. They are this, however, not because they open up Western thought and initiate it. Already before them there were thinkers. They are primordial thinkers because they think the beginning. The beginning is what is thought in their thinking. Okay, very interesting. Again, we think of in terms of deconstruction. Heidegger is we've linked deconstruction to Luther, this sort of German who sorts to peel back the sedimented layers accrued to the Christian tradition and articulates this radically new Christianity that seeks to return to the days of the apostolic church. And so Heidegger's doing something very similar here. He's thinking Western. He's trying to rethink Western philosophy by returning to these thinkers who have been so neglected. Okay, Parmenides, he tells us, is telling us about a goddess. The appearance of a divine being in the train of thought of a thinker strikes us as odd because, on the one hand, in general, a thinker is not supposed to proclaim the message of divine revelation, but is to assert on his own what he himself has questioned. The appearance of a goddess in the didactic poem, the teacherly poem of Parmenides, is particularly disconcerting because it is the goddess truth. For the truth, just like beauty, freedom, or justice, counts for us as something universal, something extracted from the singular and the actual, from what is at any particular moment true, just, or beautiful, and is therefore represented abstractly in a mere concept. So we're used to thinking of truth like beauty, freedom, justice as abstract concepts, but here, truth is a goddess, like Zeus or Hera or Aphrodite. So here we have a goddess being, this would seem to throw into question how we think about philosophy itself. Philosophy would seem to be more akin to a kind of a religious experience of a goddess who reveals truth in a temporal sense. What the Greeks name aletheia, we ordinarily translate with the word truth. If we translate, okay, so this is this conventional translation of this word as it's been passed down to us. But he says if we translate the Greek word literally, however, then aletheia says unconcealedness, right? Which is something very different than truth. But it could be that the word disclosure comes closer to the essence of the Greek aletheia than the expression unconcealedness. The word unconcealedness also directs us to something like concealedness. The directive towards concealedness and concealing provides us with the clearer realm of experience in order to understand these terms. In some way or other, we surely do know the likes of concealing and concealedness. We know it as veiling, as masking, and as covering, but also in the forms of conserving, preserving, holding back, entrusting, and appropriating, in the multiple forms of closing off and closeness. From these modes of concealedness and concealing, unconcealedness immediately gains clearer features. The realm of the concealed, unconcealed is, if we do not deceive ourselves, more immediately familiar and accessible than what is experienced in the banal titles veritas and truth. In the essence of truth as unconcealedness, there holds sway some sort of conflict with concealedness and concealment. A very, very interesting observation here, that the idea of, when we think of truth as this sort of more conventional way of thinking about truth, as this abstract concept, like truth, justice, beauty, is as an abstract concept by definition, let's say in a Kantian sense, it's been emptied of reference to the particular. It's a pure abstraction. It has no, it's an abstract concept in the sense of, say, differentiating it from, let's say, a poetic image, which has plenty of reference to the sensual. This is a concept seeks to be let's sort of a pure, in a Kantian sense, a pure concept, and yet here we have a clearly unpure concept. It's truth is a goddess. Truth is the goddess truth. But yet, as Heidegger observes, because if we think of this idea of aletheia as unconcealment, it tells us a lot more about truth than this abstract concept. It gives us, in Heideggerian, he likes to use this expression, food for thought. It gives us plenty of food for thought. Okay, the translating word unconcealedness directs to the striking fact that the Greeks think in the essence of truth something like the taking away, cancellation, or annihilation of concealment. Corresponding to this negation of concealment, truth is for the Greeks, as it were, something negative, which is very interesting to reflect upon. What we can see clearly here is only this: the essence of truth as unconcealment stands in some sort of opposition to concealment. Indeed, it appears concealedness is involved with unconcealedness is involved with concealedness in a conflict, the essence of which itself remains in dispute. Truth is never in itself available by itself, but instead must be gained by struggle. Unconcealedness is wrestled from concealment in a conflict with it. Okay, now this is really important. This, what is it called? The polemos, the conflict, the struggle to wrestle, unconcealment from concealment. This idea of truth is found in struggle. That's going to be a really central notion to reflect upon, and we'll definitely come back to this. As truth is something that has to be, that is unconcealed through struggle. The conflictual essence of truth has already been alien to us for a long time, Heidegger observes. For us, meaning us modern people, truth means the opposite. That is that which is beyond all conflict, and therefore must be non-conflictual. If it's truth, that's the end of the story. That's the end of the argument. The truth has become self-evident. For instance, the main features of the essence of truth in the modern metaphysics of Schelling and Hegel is never aletheia in the sense of unconcealedness, but is certainly in the sense of certitudo, which, since Descartes, stamps the essence of veritas. Okay, so there again we have this insistence again that one of the problems, say for instance with Hegel, is that he's Cartesian. He remains, his thinking of what is the truth is not a thinking of truth as aletheia or unconcealment, but is a thinking of truth as, certainty, the certainty of the perceiving subject, underwritten by metaphysical ground. Truth as competence. Hegel's notion of truth is truth as competence, correct perception, the squaring of the object with, with a metaphysical ground in the human interior. Okay, we'll return to that. Anything resembling the self-certitude of the self-conscious subject is alien to the Greeks. And remember, he's trying to rethink things through the lens of the Greeks, not necessarily to celebrate a nostalgic return to the Greeks, but rather to think about the truth in a different way. We would be prey to coarse falsifications if we interpreted the modern thinking of Parmenides and Heraclitus with the help of modern dialectics. So dialectics, subject-object dialectics, aren't going to do us any good in thinking about this kind of notion of truth that we find in Parmenides and Heraclitus. We can never think the true and the false, truth and falsity as separate from each other in essence, and even less could we think truth as unconcealedness in such a way, for here the oppositional relation to concealment is manifest immediately in the very name. If falsity, in the early way of thinking, already appears as one of the opposites of truth, i.e. to unconcealedness, then this essence of falsity as opposed to unconcealedness must be a type of concealedness. If unconcealedness give the essence of truth its character, then we must attempt to think falsity as a concealment. Now that's very interesting, that the false is not the way that we think of it as incompetence or incorrect perception in this Cartesian sense, but is rather a matter of concealment. And this is also going to link to the idea of this theme of forgetting, this Heideggerian theme of the forgetting of time, because again, aletheia is linked etymologically. Lethe is the river of forgetting, and so it'd be the negation of forgetting, which is in effect remembering. And so we could think of aletheia as being it's not the opposite of true. The truth as correct perception would be incorrect perception, adequacy versus inadequacy, truth versus false. Here it would be aletheia would be it wouldn't be the incorrect, it would be what is forgotten and thereby concealed. All right, aletheia and forgetting. Here's Heidegger in Parmenides again. The Greeks experienced forgetting as a coming to pass of concealment. But what does forget mean? Modern man who organizes everything in such a way that he can forget as quickly as possible should surely know what forgetting is, but he does not know. He has forgotten the essence of forgetting, supposing he ever did give it a thought. This indifference with regard to forgetting does not depend on the hastiness of his way of life. What is happening here proceeds from the very essence of forgetting, which withdraws and hides itself. It is precisely, he's going to assist, the essence of aletheia that makes it impossible for something like the subject-object relation to arise. All right, so that's a pretty strong, denunciation, rebuke of this whole subject-object epistemology, which places, Heidegger in a very different kind of it creates a very different dynamic if you think about it in terms of how we know the world, how we move about in the world. And so when we think of like contemporary post-structuralist thinkers like Derrida and Foucault, let's note that they, like Heidegger, that they follow Heidegger in this regard, and that they have moved away from this subject-object epistemology, which in effect means they agree with Heidegger that it's far too Cartesian. And this is a really interesting point to note, but it's also a very important point to note. And it's something worth thinking about when we think about a left deconstruction, or this idea that if deconstruction, if there's all the people who do deconstruction are postmodern Marxists, well, what does it mean that to be a postmodern Marxist, which is a rather ridiculous way of putting it, if you're not if your thinking is not dialectical, so you're and yet you're a Marxist, how can that be? Can it be? It's worth it's a question worth raising. Okay. Right. So now let's look at what Heidegger, how he describes what he's calling the false. What is the false? All right. This is he does a really interesting job, good job in Parmenides in exploring these primordial definitions and how and what happens when Greek philosophy is translated into the Latin, and how the thinking of the truth undergoes this profound change. That is, we could say, that truth is Latinized, or it's Romanized. The false derives from the Latin falsum. For the Romans, the falsum is bringing to a fall. The realm of essence decisive for the development of the Latin falsum is one of imperium and of the imperial. The Latin imperare means to arrange, to take measures, to occupy and advance, and so to take possession of the occupied territory and to rule it. The gods of the Greeks are not commanding gods, but rather ones that give signs, that point. The Roman gods, quite to the contrary, are designated by the Latin word numen, which means bidding and will, and has the character of a command. All right, so this is a really essential matter to consider when we think about for instance, Derrida at one point is going to call the logos a kind of a white mythology, which has indeed or he'll also speak of what he calls global Latinization, when for instance the Kantian concept of the subject gets inscribed at the heart of universal human rights and law in the UN international law, that does it promote what he's calling here, what Derrida is calling a global Latinization. Well, what his Derrida's criticism of the imperialistic nature of the way that the Kantian subject becomes hegemonic in international law is drawn directly from this kind of thinking about Latin and what happens in this transformation from the Greek to the Latin. And it's linked, the Romans were imperial people, and this is worthy of reflection. What is decisive is that this Latinization occurs as a transformation of the essence of truth and being within the essence of the Greco-Roman domain of history, Heidegger says. This transformation is distinctive in that it remains concealed, but nevertheless determines everything in advance. This transformation of the essence of truth and being is a genuine event in history. The historical state of the world we call the modern age, following the historiographical chronology, is also founded on the event of the Romanizing of Greece. Okay, so we again, this is deconstruction. This is what he's doing, and we stand for Heidegger where we are. We stand on the other side of that Latinization of the thinking of truth that we reflexively inherit, and we assume that it's natural, and there's nothing natural in it. There's something historical that has occurred, a transformation in the very concept of truth and the thinking of what truth is. But it's one that while we're under its spell for Heidegger, we're also totally oblivious to. And so he's making us aware of something that we would not have been aware of otherwise. Okay, the great and inner core of the essence of essential domination consists in this: that the dominated are not kept down, that the people the Romans dominate, nor simply despised, but rather that they themselves are permitted within the territory of the command to offer their services for the continuation of the domination. The bringing to a fall aims at keeping the overthrown standing in a certain sense, though not standing high. Okay, now that's really worth reflecting on. Let me say just a couple of things about that. Because what he's saying here is not terribly different, say, than from what Frantz Fanon says in Wretched of the Earth, when he says, well, whenever the native, hears the white European imperialists speak about, humanism and universal human rights, they reach for their gun because they know they're in trouble. And they're in trouble because Homi Bhabha puts it this way: this is because the native is not white, and so the colonizer essentially says, "Oh, we're the same. We're the same as you. We're the exact same as you, except with this difference. You're different than us." So it's like you're a human, but you're less than a human. It's like in that Austin Powers film of Mini Me. It's like there's me, and then there's Mini Me, and that's what you are. And so it's like you can continue to exist, but as a lesser version of who I am. So it's a humanism that is, Said explores this in his Orientalism as well. It's what Heidegger's saying here is akin to what Said discusses in Orientalism when he talks about Orientalist racial stereotypes being, a kind of a theater that the only man who has true agency can gaze upon, and that would be the white European imperialist. Okay. Here's Heidegger. But what does the Latin verum mean? Ver means to keep one's position, hold one's place. Ver means to steady, to keep steady, to not fall, no falsum, to remain above, to maintain oneself, to keep one's head up, to be the head, to command, maintaining oneself, standing upright, the upright. Thus it is from the essential domain of the imperial that verum, as counterword to falsum, received the sense of established right. And this is what we inherit. This is what is again very problematic about this idea of truth as competence. Verum is the remaining constant, the upright, that which is directed to what is superior because it is directing from above. Verum is rectum, the right. Veritas is then rectitudo, correctness. And this is the all-pervading basic character of the essence of truth in the West. Let me say that again. This is the all-pervading basic character of the essence of truth in the West. And so this is why, again, as I said previously, that the Cartesian concept of truth, which echoes this concept of truth that we've just been addressing, is the basic sort of target of deconstruction. The idea that the person who claims to be standing in a position of truth, and yet that truth claim is predicated upon a metaphysical ground of which the truth teller, the truth speaker, is totally oblivious. Or I think of like the fundamentalist preacher who thunders from the pulpit, totally assured of his own salvation. I mean, that's one way of thinking about it in religious terms. But if we think about it in terms of the university, I'll give you one example of this. At Western Washington University, where I teach, about 12, 15 years ago now, the university mandated the instituting of competencies. And so faculty were supposed to be required to write competencies on each and every syllabus. I refuse to do that. I've never put competencies on my syllabi, and I find it very problematic that the university, which is supposed to be a place where the truth is pursued, becomes in this model of the institution, like if our function as professors is to instill competencies, that would imply that we are standing in a position of truth, that we no longer need to pursue the truth because we found the truth, and it's our job to disseminate that truth to our students, and that would make it what we're doing much more akin to what happens in a church, for instance, or a synagogue or a mosque, is that we would be making essentially dogmatic claims to knowing the truth. And in that case, what's the point of pursuing the truth if we already have it? But it also implies a kind of a power relation between the student and the teacher, that the teacher is the one who has competence, who perceives the world correctly. The student does not. It's a very problematic model, but it's one that, unfortunately, like a cancer, has spread at other institutions as well. But it's one that definitely cries out for deconstruction at every instance. Okay. The entire thinking of the Occident, from Plato to Nietzsche, thinks in terms of this delimitation of the essence of truth as correctness, Heidegger says. This delimitation of the essence of truth is the metaphysical concept of truth. The Greek thinking of truth as unconcealment, which is still present in Plato and Aristotle, he's going to observe this. You can still see it there. That we don't. In other words, again, we're differentiating between how we've received Plato historically, what Derrida calls the Plato effect, and what you find when you actually bother to carefully read him. When you do that, you find that this way of thinking about truth is still, as aletheia, for instance, is still present in both Plato and Aristotle. But the Greek is transformed into the Greek thinking is transformed into in the Romans into the calculating self-adjustment of ratio. This determines for the future, as a consequence of a new transformation of the essence of truth, the technological character of modern, i.e. the modern machine and technology. This is the concept of truth that is just believed to be self-evidently true, and that has its origin in the originating realm out of which the imperial emerges. The imperial springs forth from the essence of truth as correctness in the sense of the directive self-adjusting. Now think through this last sentence in light of what I just said about the idea of the teaching of competencies, which also places the professor in the position of being kind of this imperial knower who is this directive self-adjusting. And it also might give us some insight into why there's so much disgruntlement about what is often called political correctness, that you come to the university and you get indoctrinated rather than pursuing questions, trying to find the truth rather than claiming to know it. And so there's in my reading, there is some truth to this the claim that universities have become too interested in teaching sort of a correct thinking, as evident in the institution of competencies. Ratio is a self-adjustment to what is correct. The res, or the thing, lies apart from ratio. And rectitudo as adequatio, ratio, or the adequate ratio is supposed to assimilate the thing, just like the native is assimilated by the imperialist. Now, what is completely lacking here is the essential space of aletheia, the unconcealedness of things and the disclosing comportment of man, a space completely covered over by debris and forgotten. Okay, again, this is this theme of the forgetting of being. The essence of truth as veritas and rectitudo is without space and without ground. Veritas as rectitudo becomes a quality of the mind or soul in the inner man, just like in Descartes or in Hegel. A question was thus bound to arise as regards truth. How is it at all possible for an inner process of mind or soul to be brought into agreement with things out there? The essence of truth is therefore determined on the basis of assurance and certitude. The true becomes the assured and certain. Now think here of Mr. Descartes and his geometrical forms, which he can be absolutely certain of. And so therefore he wants to sort of stand on that bedrock. The verum becomes certum. The question of truth becomes the question of whether and how man can be certain and assured about the being he himself is, as well as about the beings he himself is not. Okay, but again, just like in the case of Descartes, Descartes claims that he is a thinking thing, but he doesn't ask the question of what the is. Okay, now let's shift our attention to Heidegger, is the sort of the historical desedimentizing reading that he does of the transformation of the concept of the logos, or the truth, in Christianity post-John. I say John because John is just a little background here. So you have in the Gospels, you have 4 Gospels. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are considered to be the synoptic Gospels, and they're all very similar to one another. They retell some of the same stories, for instance, whereas the Gospel of John is a very different gospel. It's what theologians say has a very high Christology, has a very high way of thinking about who Jesus was. And as Elaine Pagels has very, I think, convincingly and interestingly argued in her book, The Gnostic Gospels, and in Beyond Belief, which is an investigation of the Gospel of Thomas, the so-called Doubting Thomas, that John emerges as a kind of a dialectical negation of the Gospel of Thomas, which speaks of the followers of Jesus as being like sons of God. There's not just one son of God, they're the sons of God. Well, in John, there's only one son of God, and that's Jesus. And so John has a very high concept of who Jesus is. And so we're going to find here John articulating Jesus as the Logos. All right, it's very, you think about this, how weird this would have been to Plato, for instance, to think about the Logos as a particular historical personage, conflated with a human being. So you think of the Logos, in the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God. This is John. So this Word is the uncreated Word, which is co-eternal with God, prior to creation. So Jesus assumes this very very exalted status in the Gospel of John, but he's conflated with the concept of the Logos. And it's precisely this conflation that Heidegger is going to be interested in examining, and he's going to compare how Jesus becomes Logos in the Johnnine Christian tradition, which is then reaffirmed, by Augustine, for instance, with what the thinking of the Logos was in Heraclitus. All right, so let's read what Heidegger says. He says, the Roman world in the form of the ecclesiastical dogmatics of the Christian faith has contributed essentially to the consolidation of the essence of truth in the sense of rectitudo, or rectitude. The same realm of Christian faith introduces and prepares the new transformation of the essence of truth, the one of verum into serum, the doctrine of justification, and indeed as the question of the certainty of salvation becomes the center of evangelical theology. For Christianity, the Lord is God, the Lord is also reason, the Lord is the world spirit, the Lord is the will to power. Okay, so he's also going to say, and this is a little earlier in Introduction to Metaphysics, when he differentiates what he's doing from what Christian theologians do. They say, anyone for whom the Bible is divine revelation and truth already has the answer to the question, why are there beings instead of nothing at all? before it is even asked. Beings, with the exception of God himself, are created by him or by God. God himself is as the uncreated creator. One who holds onto such faith as a basis can perhaps, he'll say, emulate and participate in the asking of our question in a certain way, but he cannot authentically question without giving himself up as a believer with all the consequences of this step. He can only act as if. Okay, well, we've seen this word as if before, and we've discussed it. But this is a very Kantian phrase, and this is exactly what we find in Kant. It's as if there is an essence, but to say more than that is, and to inquire into the nature of what that is that's very different from from the assertion of faith, and it is from the Christian perspective sheer foolishness, as Heidegger will observe. It says, what is asked in our question, which is again Hamlet's question, why are there beings rather than nothing at all, is for faith foolishness. But philosophy consists in such foolishness. A Christian philosophy, he's going to say, is a round square and is misunderstood. There is no Christian philosophy for Heidegger. To be sure, one can thoughtfully question and work through the world of Christian experience, that is the world of faith. That is then theology. But philosophy for originally Christian faith is foolishness, because philosophy means asking, why are there beings rather than nothing at all? Okay, let's continue. All right, so he's going to say it was Christianity that first misinterpreted Heraclitus. The misinterpretation already began with the early church fathers. Hegel still stands in this line. Heraclitus's note that observation. Hegel still stands in this line. This is why there's a lot of kind of strange, kind of Hegelian Christian theological paradigms out there, and it's because again he's directly in this line. Heraclitus' teaching on Logos is taken as a predecessor of the Logos mentioned in the New Testament in the prologue to the Gospel of John. The Logos is Christ. And there you have this Johannine prologue in the beginning. I'm going to say it with the Greek there because it's written in Greek. In the beginning was the Logos, and the Logos was with God, and the Logos was God. Now, again, if the Logos is Jesus, I think that would leave Plato scratching his head, as well as certainly Heraclitus scratching his head, because Heraclitus, although the thought of Plato is closer to the thought of John in some ways, and thinking of the Logos as the word inscribed on the soul. In the case of Heraclitus, is a very, very different way of thinking about the Logos, which is almost as we're going to see, it's linked to kind of an agricultural term. You can think of a kind of a gathering, as in a like if you take a bunch of reeds or stalks or any crop that you give, and you tie it up together, and everything is kind of gathered together. Now because Heraclitus already speaks of the Logos, the Greeks arrived at the very doorstep of absolute truth, namely the revealed truth of Christianity, in this and what he was regarding as a distorted interpretation of the Logos. According to this widespread version of history, which he finds, I think, laughable, the Greeks are the classics of philosophy because they were not yet full-fledged Christian theologians. But we will see whether Heraclitus is a precursor of John the evangelist after we have heard from Heraclitus himself. So let's now look at what Heraclitus actually says. And so what Heidegger does is he takes a fragment on the Logos from Heraclitus. I'm going to contrast here how Heidegger, with this sort of idiosyncratic translation, translated versus an alternative translation, which you both find in Introduction to Metaphysics. Here's Heidegger. Hence, one must follow the together in beings. That is to adhere to it, but whereas Logos essentially unfolds as this together in beings, the mass, like the mass of people out there, lives as if each had his own understanding or sense. Okay, there's Heidegger's translation. Now, the more conventional translation of Heraclitus's fragment is, hence one must follow what is common. But while the logos is common, the men live as if each had, or men live as if each had his own understanding. Okay, let's now look at Heidegger's. This is Heidegger's gloss or interpretation of this fragment. So let's see what he does with this fragment. Okay, he says, it is said of logos by Heraclitus that is, number one, constancy, lasting is proper to it, to logos. Number two, logos essentially unfolds as the together in beings, the together of being that which gathers. All right. Number three, everything that happens, that is, that comes into being, stands there in accordance with this constant together. That is what holds sway. All right, now what is said of logos by Heraclitus corresponds, Heidegger says, exactly to the authentic meaning of the word gathering. All right, so again, it's another translation problem. But just as this word denotes both, number one, to gather, and number two, gatheredness, logos means here the gathering gatheredness. All right, now think about, let's pause on that for just a minute. Logos as one, on the one hand, we have in the Christian system, we have the logos is the co-eternal word prior to creation with God, and that word is Jesus Christ, a historical personage. That's very different from what Heidegger's saying here, which is the gathering gatheredness. Logos as gathering gatheredness. Gathering gatheredness. That which originally gathers. Logos here does not mean sense, he says. It doesn't mean word or doctrine, and it's certainly not the sense of a doctrine, but instead the originally gathering gatheredness that constantly holds sway in itself. Logos, that which is constantly together, gatheredness. Human beings remain those who do not bring it together, do not grasp it, do not seize it as a unity, whether they have not yet heard or have already heard. Human beings do not get through to logos, all right? Heraclitus wants to say human beings do hear, and they hear words, but in this hearing they cannot hearken to, that is, follow, what is not audible like words, what is not talk, but logos. Okay, so it's something that we have a difficult time, grasping. Genuine hearkening, he's going to say, has nothing to do with the ear and the glib tongue, but instead means obediently to follow what the logos is, the gatheredness of beings themselves. Human beings constantly have to do with being, and yet it is alien to them. They turn away from being because they don't grasp it at all. Instead, they believe that beings are only beings and nothing further. Logos, however, is constant gathering, the gatheredness of beings that stands in itself, that is being. Okay, this is from Introduction to Metaphysics. And again, that's the idea of the gatheredness of beings themselves. It's a very different way of thinking, or constant gathering, very different way of thinking about logos than what exists in the Christian tradition. Now, whatever your personal views may be, I just want you to note here, this is deconstruction. This is, again, peeling back the desedimented layers that have accrued to our concepts and looking and finding out, what we can understand. Not, again, as Spivak will say, not to find some originary truth, but to look at the itinerary of the silencing. What happened, so that we in this what took place in the transformation of our way of thinking about truth in the past, and then what does that say to us in the future? All right, because as Derrida will observe in his writings on the archive, the archive is not a question of the past. What exists in the archive, like in the archives of Heraclitus or Parmenides, it's not a question of what happened a long time ago. It's the meaning of the archive doesn't lie in the past; it lies in the future. And this is why one investigates these concepts, not to discover, not to do some sort of archaeological reading to discover some originary truth, but to do a more what Nietzsche would call genealogical reading, to examine this itinerary of the silencing and then ask oneself, well, how should we direct ourselves in the future, given now that we know, these facts about the history of the concept of truth. Okay, here's Heidegger from Introduction to Metaphysics. That which contends is gathering gatheredness, logos. Okay, gathering gatheredness. The being of all beings is what is most seemly. That is what is most beautiful, what is most constant in itself. I think of Greek, statues, and what the Greek art, what it really aims for is, as the gathering gatheredness, as the constant. They're not interested in, like Stephen Crane and his red badge of courage, showing us, or Emile Zola, in his Germinal, showing us the gritty life of coal miners in France. They're after something quite different than what naturalism is after. In late 19th century naturalism. What the Greeks mean by beauty is discipline. The gathering together of the highest contending is polemos. All right, struggle in the sense of confrontation. Now we're going to have to return to this when we think about the relationship between Heidegger and fascist ideology. This question of struggle as being a valorized concept of wrestling, unconcealment from concealment as a matter of polemos. For the Greeks, art is the opening up of the being of beings. All right, let's look at that again. For the Greeks, art is the opening up of the being of beings, capital B, small b. Take that phrase, write it down, have it in your mind, memorize it, and then just do a Google search on Greek art, and then just look at the art and see if you can figure out what Heidegger is trying to say here by examining some of the art from ancient Athens and Greece. All right, so Heidegger is going to say the Roman translation of logos became definitive for Christianity and the Christian Middle Ages. So I remember the Holy Roman Church was indeed the Holy Roman Church. It came from Rome. It was based in Rome, and its Latinization, its Romanization has this legacy in the reception of this notion. Here's Heidegger again, Introduction to Metaphysics. In the New Testament, logos does not mean, as in Heraclitus, the being of beings, the gatheredness of that which contends, but logos means one particular being, namely the Son of God. Furthermore, it means him in the role of mediator between God and humanity. The announcement of cross is Christ himself. I think in Arabic it's tawil. It's like archetypal, image. He is the logos of salvation, eternal life, logos zoe. A world separates all this from Heraclitus. All right. So again, whatever your personal views are, point here is not to, take your religious beliefs from you or to call them into question in any as inherently false in any sense, but rather to just take a step back and think about the differences in what happens in the transformation, historical transformation of this concept of the logos, or to quote Frederick Jameson, if our task is to always historicize, this is in fact what Heidegger is doing here in a deconstructive way, is he's historicizing. Okay, only by undergoing the struggle between being and seeming, the world of being, the world of becoming, the world of what appears to be and what is, did the Greeks wrest being forth from beings. Did they bring beings into constancy and unconcealment? But with the sophists and Plato, seeming was explained as and thus reduced to mere seeming. Okay, you may recall we looked at this quote earlier. At the same time, being as idea was elevated to a supersensory realm, so the Platonic ideal realm. The chasm chorismos chora was torn open between the merely apparent beings here below and the real being somewhere up there. Christian doctrine then established itself in this chasm, while at the same time reinterpreting the below as created and the above as creator. And with weapons thus forged, it set itself against antiquity and distorted it. And so Nietzsche is right to say that Christianity is Platonism for the masses. In contrast, the great age of Greek Dasein is a unique, creative, self-assertion amid the turmoil of the multiply intertwined counterplay of the powers of being and seeming. Okay, so all of this is coming to us from the erstwhile Catholic theologian who wrote his first dissertation on Thomas Aquinas, grew up in the Catholic Church, and has moved to a very different place throughout his life. At one point, Heidegger is going to say atheism is a point of honor in philosophy. Now, Gadamer's view on that, I mean, there was a very enigmatic interview with Heidegger at the end of his life where he said something like, it's going to take a God to save us. And Gadamer, his most famous pupil, read that as being Heidegger saying, or one of his, maybe not his most famous, but a famous pupil of Heidegger, is going to read that as Heidegger saying that that this was effectively Heidegger kind of like, we talked about with Freud in the Freud talk, returning to the fold of his youth. Religious background. I'm not so sure that that's true, but whatever the case may be, it is worth reflecting upon, particularly when you think about. Like just one example of this, when you think about the Monophysite traditions in Africa and in Egypt and the Middle East, who don't embrace the doctrine of the Trinity that emerges in 451, and who have a very different way of thinking about the Christian tradition. So Heidegger is drawing our attention to the way in which the history of these concepts that are often that are left undeconstructed, unconsidered, have this enduring influence in ways that we're often totally oblivious to. Okay, now I want to note here, as we're getting closer to the conclusion of our lecture, that Heidegger does not exempt. Although Heidegger is let me say this. Although Heidegger is influenced by Nietzsche in a very profound way, as have been so many people, including Derrida and Foucault, he has. Well, let me just say it this way. He has a 4-volume study. It's just entitled Nietzsche, volume 1, 2, 3, and 4. Very much recommend reading it. It's a big reading project, but if you read it, as it did for Foucault, it'll totally transform your thinking about Nietzsche, and it'll make a lot of what is difficult to understand in Nietzsche more easier to understand. But in this 4-volume study, it has a kind of an arc that goes sort of up and down. In the first 2 volumes, Heidegger is almost, you can see him, he's really enthralled with Nietzsche and just very excited, and then he starts moving towards a more critical. His view becomes more critical, and one of the conclusions that Heidegger is going to end up in is that Nietzsche does not really escape kind of a Cartesianism in his own thought as well, and that his doctrine of the eternal return, it culminates Western metaphysics, but it also it doesn't get out of this kind of Cartesian metaphysics that Heidegger is going to be critical of. And so I want to note this, because we'll come back to this when we read Derrida, is that Heidegger is not his position from Nietzsche finally ends up being kind of a critical position, and so we're going to see by contrast that I'm going to argue, show you, make a case for how Derrida, although he's often thought of as the French Heidegger, it may be more appropriate to think of Derrida as being influenced by Nietzsche than Heidegger, because while Derrida is very influenced by Heidegger, his thinking, particularly with respect to the doctrine of the eternal return, what we'll investigate is the doctrine of the eternal return, this sort of yes saying, is more Nietzschean, and he's not going to follow Heidegger here in this critique of Nietzsche. But let's look at what Heidegger says about Nietzsche. He's going to say, for Nietzsche, what is necessary is that something must be held to be true, not that something is true. So there is, as in Descartes, there is a forgetting of a lack or failure to pose the question of what the is. Heidegger's underscoring of the must here signals his critique of the ethical dimension of Nietzsche's thought on the eternal return, which we'll get back to. For Nietzsche, it has been decided in advance and in accordance with the Western philosophical tradition that truth is correctness. What is true for Nietzsche is what is held in being. Nietzsche is basically thinking none other than this: truth is correctness. He seems to have completely forgotten his saying that truth is an illusion. Nietzsche even seems to be in agreement with Kant, who once notes explicitly in his critique of pure reason that the explanation of truth as the agreement of knowledge with its object is here granted and presupposed. Hence, for Heidegger anyway, Nietzsche does not just seem to be in harmony with this Western tradition. He is in harmony with it. Only for this reason must he distinguish himself from it. Okay, we'll return to that when we look at Derrida, but I just wanted you to be aware of that Heideggerian critique of Nietzsche as being oblivious to a kind of a Cartesian element in his own thought. All right, so here are some questions for consideration, particularly as we are going to turn in our next lecture to questions of the political implications, ethical implications of much of what Heidegger is saying. Or his failure to, one could say his failure to attend to the ethical implications of what he's saying in his own personal politics. Heidegger states, it is entirely correct and completely in order to say you can't do anything with philosophy. The only mistake, he's going to say, this is an introduction to metaphysics, is to believe that with this, the judgment concerning philosophy is at an end. For a little epilogue arises in the form of a counter question. Even if we can't do anything with philosophy, may not philosophy in the end do something with us, provided that we engage ourselves with it? All right, this is from the introduction to metaphysics. All right, so if philosophy if Heidegger's right to say, if Heidegger says you're right if you say philosophy is useless, but with this, the question of philosophy doesn't come to an end, because even if we can't do anything with philosophy, it may very well end up doing something with us. That's a very important thing to reflect upon in terms of this Marxian question of praxis. What is it that philosophy does to us? What are the implications in a political sense of that view? And then, as we'll explore in the next lecture, what were Heidegger's politics? Why did he find it? Why did he end up affiliating himself with the Nazis? Where did he go wrong? He said that he went wrong. It was the stupidity of his life. Although there's been a lot of debate about that with the Black Notebooks, but he did say that. Anyway, we're not going to defend his. We're not going to try to recuperate his thinking. Or to show that he was actually secretly benign, and we're not interested in that kind of reading of Heidegger. We want to look at what the facts are and what we find in our examination of these documents, and then you come to your own conclusions. Again, I'm not here to teach competence.